My son didn't let me attend my husband's funeral. A week later, at the inheritance meeting, he kicked me out saying, "This table is only for those who are entitled to something." I simply called my lawyer. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I never imagined that after 45 years of marriage, I would be standing outside St. Mary's Church, watching my husband's funeral through a window like a stranger. But there I was, clutching my black purse with trembling hands, tears streaming down my cheeks as I watched Dean accept condolences that should have been mine to receive. "You can't go in there, Mother." Those words still echo in my mind, spoken with such cold finality that they felt like a physical blow. My own son, my only child, had blocked my path to the church steps that morning. "You don't deserve to be here after what you put Dad through, what I put Harold through." The accusation was so absurd, so cruel, that I couldn't even find words to defend myself. Harold and I had our struggles like any couple, but we loved each other deeply. We'd weathered storms together, celebrated victories, and grown old side by side. How could Dean twist our relationship into something ugly? But there he stood, 6'2" and imposing in his expensive black suit. His wife Cheryl beside him with that satisfied smirk she always wore when I was being humiliated. She whispered something in his ear, and he nodded grimly. "Dean, please," I had begged, my voice breaking. He was my husband. "I have every right to be there." "You gave up that right years ago," he replied, not even looking at me directly. "Dad told me things, Mother. Things about how you treated him when you thought no one was watching." I felt my legs go weak. Harold would never have said such things because they weren't true. But Dean seemed so convinced, so certain of his righteous anger. I realized then that Cheryl had been working on him for months, maybe years, planting seeds of doubt and resentment. I watched helplessly as people filed into the church, neighbors who had known Harold and me for decades, friends from the bridge club, former colleagues from Harold's accounting firm. Some of them glanced my way with confusion, clearly wondering why I wasn't inside. Others looked away quickly, embarrassed to witness my humiliation. Mrs. Patterson from next door actually started walking toward me, concern written across her weathered face. But Cheryl intercepted her smoothly, linking arms and guiding her into the church with some whispered explanation that made Mrs. Patterson's expression shift from confusion to what looked like pity. Standing there on the sidewalk, I felt more alone than I had ever felt in my 73 years. The September wind cut through my black coat, and I pulled it tighter around myself. I could hear the organ music beginning inside, the same hymns Harold and I had sung together every Sunday for decades. Through the stained glass windows, I caught glimpses of the ceremony I should have been part of. I saw Dean standing at the podium, delivering what I'm sure was a beautiful eulogy about his father. People nodded and dabbed at their eyes with tissues. It looked like a proper goodbye, the kind Harold deserved. But it was happening without me. I thought about all the nights I'd sat by Harold's bedside during his final illness, holding his hand while he slept fitfully. I thought about the medications I'd organized, the doctor's appointments I'd driven him to, the way I'd helped him maintain his dignity, even when the cancer was stealing his strength day by day. None of that seemed to matter to Dean. In his mind, I was somehow the villain in this story. After what felt like hours, people began emerging from the church. The pallbearers, Dean and 5 of Harold's friends, carried the casket to the waiting hearse. I pressed myself against a tree, trying to become invisible as the funeral procession formed. Dean climbed into the lead car with Cheryl, accepting the role of chief mourner that should have been mine. As they drove past, Cheryl actually turned to look at me through the window, her lips curved in the faintest smile. I didn't go to the cemetery. I couldn't bear to watch from a distance again, couldn't stand to see Harold lowered into the ground while I remained an outsider to his final farewell. Instead, I drove home to the empty house that still smelled like his aftershave and the mint tea he drank every evening. I sat in his favorite chair and wept until I had no tears left. But even through my grief, something else was stirring inside me, a quiet determination that surprised me with its strength. Dean thought he could erase me from Harold's life, rewrite our history to suit his narrative. He thought he could humiliate me and I would simply accept it. He was wrong. Harold had always been a careful man, methodical in everything he did. As I sat in that empty house, I began to remember things he'd said in those final weeks, comments that hadn't made sense at the time, but were starting to form a pattern. "Trust me, Opal," he'd whispered one night when the pain was particularly bad. "I've made sure you'll be taken care of. Dean doesn't know everything." At the time, I'd assumed he was just trying to comfort me about finances. But now, with fresh humiliation burning in my chest, I wondered if Harold had known something I didn't. Had he seen through Dean's facade? Had he anticipated this betrayal? Tomorrow, Dean would probably call a family meeting to discuss Harold's affairs. He'd want to take control of everything, just like he'd taken control of the funeral. But Harold had been keeping secrets for 45 years of marriage. Maybe it was time for some of those secrets to come to light. The call came exactly 1 week after the funeral, just as I was watering Harold's prized tomato plants in the backyard. Dean's voice on the phone was businesslike, cold. "We need to meet about Dad's estate. Tomorrow at 2 o'clock at the house." "Of course," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll be there. Bring whatever financial documents you have access to. We need to get everything sorted out properly." The way he said properly made my stomach clench, like I had been doing things improperly all these years, like I needed his permission to handle affairs in the home I'd shared with his father for over 4 decades. I spent that evening going through Harold's desk, gathering papers I thought might be relevant. Bank statements, insurance policies, the deed to the house, all the mundane documents that make up a life. My hands shook slightly as I organized everything into a folder. I kept thinking about Harold's words. Dean doesn't know everything. The next afternoon, I arrived at what had been my own home for so long, but now felt foreign and unwelcoming. Dean's luxury SUV was parked in the driveway, along with Cheryl's red BMW and another car I didn't recognize. I let myself in with my key, calling out softly, "Hello, I'm here." "In the dining room," Dean's voice came back, sharp and impatient. I walked into the dining room where Harold and I had shared thousands of meals, celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, hosted holiday dinners. Now it had been transformed into something that felt more like a courtroom than the heart of our home. Dean sat at the head of the table, Harold's place, with papers spread before him like a prosecutor preparing his case. Cheryl sat to his right, perfectly groomed as always, her manicured fingers drumming silently on the mahogany surface. To Dean's left sat a man I didn't recognize, middle-aged with a briefcase beside his chair. "This is Robert Chen, Dad's attorney," Dean announced without preamble. "He's going to walk us through the will and estate planning." I moved toward one of the empty chairs, the same one I'd sat in for decades of family dinners. But before I could sit down, Dean's voice stopped me cold. "Actually, Mother, this meeting is for immediate family members only." I froze, my hand still on the back of the chair. "I'm sorry, what?" Cheryl looked up at me with those cold blue eyes, not even trying to hide her satisfaction. "Dean means this is for people who actually have a stake in Harold's estate." The words hit me like a slap. I looked around the table, seeing the papers spread out, the serious expressions, the way they were all looking at me like I was an intruder. "Harold was my husband," I said quietly, my voice barely audible even to myself. Dean's jaw tightened. "Yes, and you made his life miserable for the last 10 years. Did you think we didn't notice how you controlled everything? How you kept him from his friends? How you made him feel guilty for wanting to spend time with his own son?" Each accusation felt like another nail being driven into my coffin. None of it was true, but the conviction in Dean's voice made me wonder if he actually believed these lies, or if this was all an elaborate performance. "Dean, that's not—" I started, but he cut me off. "This table is for people who have rights to something here. People Dad actually cared about." The cruelty in those words took my breath away. I stood there, clutching my folder of documents, feeling smaller and more insignificant than I ever had in my life. The man who had emerged from my body 38 years ago was telling me that his father hadn't cared about me. Mr. Chen shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," he suggested, clearly sensing the tension. "No," Dean said firmly. "Mother needs to understand her position here. Dad may have felt obligated to stay married to you, but that doesn't mean you're entitled to anything that should rightfully go to his son." Cheryl leaned forward slightly, her voice sickeningly sweet. "Opal, surely you understand that Dean has been the one Harold really depended on these last few years. You're comfortable enough with your Social Security and the small savings account. Dean has a family to think about. Real responsibilities. As if caring for a dying husband wasn't a real responsibility. As if 45 years of marriage were just something to be brushed aside." I looked at Mr. Chen, hoping for some voice of reason, some legal perspective that might cut through this nightmare. But he avoided my eyes, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge his client's son. "I think you should leave now," Dean said, his tone final. "We have important matters to discuss. And frankly, your presence here is inappropriate." The dismissal was so complete, so absolute, that for a moment I couldn't move. I stood there looking at my son, this man I had raised, worried over, loved unconditionally, and saw only a stranger. A stranger who was taking pleasure in humiliating me. "Dean," I said one more time, my voice barely a whisper. "Please. Goodbye, Mother." I walked out of that dining room on legs that felt like they might collapse at any moment. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of voices resuming their discussion, the rustle of papers being shuffled. They were dividing up Harold's life without me, erasing my existence from the equation as if I had never mattered at all. But as I reached my car, something crystallized inside me. The fog of grief and shock began to clear, replaced by something sharper, more focused. Harold had always been careful about important things. He'd always protected me, sometimes in ways I didn't even realize until later. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, not starting the engine. Through the dining room window, I could see Dean gesturing as he spoke, Cheryl nodding along, Mr. Chen taking notes. They looked so confident, so certain that they had everything figured out. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. The number was still programmed in from years ago, though I hadn't called it in a long time. Harold's personal attorney, not the family lawyer Dean had chosen, but the man Harold had consulted privately on several occasions over the years. "Robert Morrison's office," came the familiar voice of his secretary. "This is Opal Whitfield," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I need to schedule an appointment with Mr. Morrison as soon as possible. It's about my husband Harold's estate." "Of course, Mrs. Whitfield. Mr. Morrison has been expecting your call." "Expecting my call?" My heart began to race as the implications settled in. Harold had been planning for this moment all along. Robert Morrison's office felt like a sanctuary after the hostile atmosphere of my own dining room. The elderly attorney greeted me with genuine warmth, his silver hair and kind eyes reminding me of Harold in some ways. As I settled into the leather chair across from his desk, I felt like I could breathe freely for the first time in days. "Opal, I'm so sorry for your loss," he said, his voice carrying decades of professional compassion. "Harold was a good man, and he loved you very much." The simple acknowledgement of Harold's love brought tears to my eyes. "Thank you. I'm afraid I'm quite confused about some things. Though, Dean seems to think..." Mr. Morrison held up a gentle hand. "Before we discuss anything else, I need you to understand something important. Harold came to see me privately several times over the past 2 years. He was very concerned about certain family dynamics. Family dynamics. That was a polite way of putting it. He knew? I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. He knew that Dean and Cheryl were working to turn him against you. He knew they were spreading lies, poisoning family relationships for their own gain. Harold was heartbroken about it, but he wasn't fooled. I closed my eyes, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness wash over me. Harold had seen through their manipulation, but he'd suffered because of it too. "Why didn't he say anything to me?" I whispered. "Because he was protecting you," Mr. Morrison replied. "He knew that if you understood the full extent of their scheming, it would destroy you. He also knew that confronting Dean directly would only make things worse." As he spoke, memories began flooding back with startling clarity. Conversations I'd dismissed, moments I'd explained away, incidents that now made perfect sense. I remembered the day 2 years ago when Dean had insisted Harold needed a new financial advisor, someone younger, more up-to-date with current strategies, he'd said. Harold had seemed reluctant, but eventually agreed to meet with the man Dean recommended. What I hadn't known was that Harold had quietly continued seeing Mr. Morrison throughout that entire process. I remembered Cheryl's sudden interest in family genealogy, how she'd encouraged Harold to share stories about his childhood, his parents, his memories of building our life together. At the time, I'd thought it was sweet. Now I realized she'd been gathering information, looking for ammunition. They were planning this for a long time, I said, more to myself than to Mr. Morrison. Yes. Harold began to piece it together about 18 months ago. Dean's visits became more frequent, but they weren't really about spending time with his father. He was always asking questions about finances, about Harold's health, about your relationship. The pattern was becoming clear now. Dean would visit when I was at my book club or grocery shopping. He'd call Harold with concerns about my spending habits or my controlling behavior. Slowly, methodically, he'd been building a case against me in his father's mind, except Harold hadn't believed any of it. One thing that particularly upset Harold, Mr. Morrison continued, was when Dean suggested you were suffering from early dementia. He claimed you were becoming forgetful, making poor decisions, that Harold needed to protect himself legally. I gasped. He said that? Multiple times. Dean was pushing Harold to revise his will, to set up a trust that would essentially cut you out of any significant inheritance. He claimed it was for your own protection, that you couldn't handle financial responsibility. The manipulation was breathtaking in its scope and cruelty. Dean hadn't just been working to turn Harold against me. He'd been trying to convince Harold that I was mentally incompetent. But Harold saw right through it, Mr. Morrison assured me. In fact, that's when he decided to take action. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder, thick with documents. Harold spent months carefully documenting every conversation, every suggestion Dean made, every lie Cheryl told about your behavior. He wanted to be absolutely certain about their motivations before he made his final decisions. What kind of decisions? I asked, though my heart was already racing with anticipation. Harold created a new will, one that Dean knows nothing about. He also established several financial safeguards to protect you and ensure that Dean's manipulations couldn't succeed even after Harold's death. I stared at the folder, hardly daring to believe what I was hearing. Harold knew this would happen? He knew Dean would try to exclude me? He hoped it wouldn't come to that. But yes, he prepared for the possibility. Harold was always a careful man, but in his final months, he became absolutely meticulous about protecting you. As Mr. Morrison opened the folder and began spreading documents across his desk, I thought about those last weeks with Harold. The private phone calls he'd made when he thought I was sleeping. The afternoons when he'd claimed to be resting, but I'd heard the soft click of his laptop keyboard. The way he'd hold my hand and tell me not to worry about anything. Trust me, Opal, he'd said so many times. Everything will be all right. He'd been working, even while battling cancer, to ensure my security and dignity. While Dean and Cheryl were scheming to betray me, Harold was quietly outmaneuvering them. There's something else, Mr. Morrison said, his expression growing more serious. Harold left specific instructions about how this information should be revealed. He wanted Dean to show his true character first, without any interference. He said it was important for you to see exactly who your son had become. The wisdom of that strategy was becoming clear. If Harold had confronted Dean while he was alive, Dean could have simply changed tactics, become more subtle in his manipulation. This way, Dean had revealed himself completely, burned every bridge, shown his true nature without any possibility of pretending otherwise. So what happens now? I asked. Mr. Morrison smiled, and for the first time in weeks, I saw genuine hope in someone's eyes when they looked at me. Now, we give Dean exactly what he's asking for. A family meeting where everything is made clear, where all the truth comes out. He picked up his phone. I think it's time to schedule a proper reading of Harold's will, the real one. As I listened to him making the call, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Harold's diagnosis, a sense of anticipation rather than dread. Dean thought he'd won, thought he'd successfully erased me from the family narrative. Harold had other plans. The second family meeting was scheduled for the following Friday, exactly 2 weeks after Harold's funeral. This time, the call came from Mr. Morrison's office, not from Dean. I could only imagine the confusion and irritation that call must have caused. Mrs. Whitfield, Mr. Morrison has asked me to inform all parties that there are some discrepancies in the estate documentation that need to be addressed immediately. His secretary had explained to Dean over the phone, her voice professionally neutral. I spent the week in a strange state of suspended animation. Part of me was terrified that this was all some mistake, that Harold's protections wouldn't be enough to overcome Dean's manipulations. But another part of me, growing stronger each day, felt an odd sense of peace. Harold had loved me enough to plan for this moment. I wasn't facing this battle alone. On Friday morning, I dressed carefully in the navy blue suit Harold had always said brought out my eyes. I wanted to look dignified, composed, unbroken by the cruelties of the past weeks. When I arrived at the house, Dean's SUV and Cheryl's BMW were already there, along with Mr. Chen's sedan and a car I didn't recognize. I used my key one more time, knowing it might be the last time I ever entered this house as someone with the right to be there. Dean was pacing in the living room when I walked in, his face flushed with irritation. Cheryl sat rigidly on the sofa, her usual smugness replaced by barely controlled anxiety. Mr. Chen stood by the window, checking his watch repeatedly. "What the hell is this about?" Dean demanded as soon as he saw me. "Some other lawyer claiming there are problems with Dad's will? Did you put him up to this?" Before I could answer, the doorbell rang. Dean strode to answer it, and I heard Mr. Morrison's calm voice introducing himself. He entered the living room carrying a leather briefcase, followed by a younger woman with a court reporter's equipment. "Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Robert Morrison, and I was Harold Whitfield's personal attorney for the past 15 years. This is Ms. Sarah Chen, a certified court reporter who will be documenting today's proceedings." Mr. Chen looked confused. "I don't understand. I'm Harold's attorney. I handled his will preparation 6 months ago." Mr. Morrison's expression remained pleasant but firm. "You handled one will preparation, Mr. Chen." Harold maintained separate legal counsel for his most important documents. The room fell silent, except for the soft clicking of Ms. Chen setting up her equipment. Dean's face had gone pale, while Cheryl gripped the arm of the sofa so tightly her knuckles were white. "What are you talking about?" Dean asked, his voice strained. Mr. Morrison opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick document bound in blue legal backing. "I'm talking about Harold's actual last will and testament, executed 3 months before his death and properly witnessed and notarized." He looked around the room, his gaze settling on each person present. Harold was very specific about how this will should be presented. He wanted to ensure that certain behaviors and attitudes were fully documented before the true terms of his estate were revealed. Dean sank into a chair, the color draining from his face. "That's impossible. Dad and I went over everything. He showed me the will?" "Yes. Harold told me about those conversations. He also told me about your suggestions regarding your mother's mental competency, your recommendations for financial guardianship, and your concerns about her ability to manage an inheritance." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Cheryl shifted uncomfortably, finally speaking up. Harold was obviously confused in his final months. Whatever he told you was probably influenced by medication or illness. Mr. Morrison's smile was cold. Harold was mentally sharp until the day he died, as confirmed by 2 independent medical evaluations he requested specifically to prevent that kind of challenge to his final wishes. He opened the will and cleared his throat. Harold was quite detailed in his final document. He addresses the attempts to manipulate him, the lies told about his wife, and his disappointment in his son's character. Dean jumped to his feet. "You can't be serious. Dad would never disinherit his own son." "You're right," Mr. Morrison replied calmly. "Harold didn't disinherit you completely. You are mentioned in the will." He flipped to a specific page. "To my son Dean, who has shown me in my final years what kind of man he truly is, I leave the sum of $10,000. This represents approximately what I estimate he would have inherited if he had treated his mother with even basic human decency." The silence that followed was deafening. Dean's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "That can't be legal," Cheryl said, her voice shrill. "A son has rights to his father's estate. Actually, in this state, a person has complete discretion over how to distribute their assets, provided they are of sound mind and not under duress." Harold's multiple medical evaluations and the detailed documentation of his reasoning make this will virtually uncontestable. Mr. Morrison continued reading. "The remainder of Harold's estate, including this house, all financial accounts, investments, and personal property, goes entirely to his beloved wife Opal, who stood by him faithfully for 45 years and deserved better than the treatment she received from his son." I felt the room spinning around me. Everything. Harold had left me everything, but Mr. Morrison wasn't finished. Harold also included specific provisions regarding Dean's behavior. Any attempt to contest this will, harass Opal, or interfere with her inheritance will result in the immediate forfeiture of his $10,000 bequest, which will instead be donated to the Cancer Research Foundation where Harold volunteered. Dean was staring at the floor, his entire body trembling with what I realized was rage, not grief. Cheryl had gone completely white, probably calculating how this would affect their own financial plans. "Furthermore," Mr. Morrison continued, "Harold established a protective trust to ensure that Opal never has to depend on Dean for anything. He was quite explicit that his son had forfeited any right to make decisions about his mother's welfare." The young court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard, documenting every word of this devastating revelation. Everything Dean had assumed, everything he'd planned for, every cruel word he'd spoken, it had all been for nothing. "There are also some personal letters Harold left," Mr. Morrison said, producing several sealed envelopes. "One for Opal and one for Dean." He handed me my envelope with gentle care, but held Dean's out with obvious reluctance. Dean snatched it from his hand, tearing it open with shaking fingers. As Dean read, his face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, anger, and finally something that might have been shame. The letter was short, but whatever Harold had written hit its target with precision. "He knew," Dean whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. "He knew everything." Mr. Morrison packed up his documents with the same methodical care Harold had always shown. "The estate will be settled within 30 days. Opal, you'll need to come by my office next week to handle the paperwork." As the lawyers prepared to leave, Dean finally looked at me directly for the first time since the reading began. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of the little boy I'd once loved unconditionally. "Mom," he started, but then stopped, as if he'd forgotten how to talk to me as his mother instead of his victim. I stood up, smoothing my skirt, feeling Harold's protection surrounding me like an invisible shield. "Goodbye, Dean," I said quietly. "I hope someday you remember who you used to be." Harold had given me more than just financial security. He'd given me the dignity of walking away on my own terms. That evening, I sat alone in Harold's study, the letter from him still unopened on the desk. The house felt different now. Not like a place I was being pushed out of, but like the home Harold and I had built together over 4 decades. Dean and Cheryl had left immediately after the will reading, their faces masks of shock and fury. Mr. Chen had mumbled apologies about the confusion before hurrying out behind them, but the silence that followed wasn't empty. It felt full of Harold's presence, his love, his careful planning that had protected me even from beyond the grave. With trembling fingers, I opened his letter. "My dearest Opal," it began in his familiar handwriting, slightly shakier than it used to be but still unmistakably his. "If you're reading this, then the worst has happened. Not my death, which we both knew was coming, but Dean's betrayal, which I hoped against hope might not come to pass." I had to stop reading for a moment, tears blurring the words. Harold had hoped Dean would prove him wrong, would show some decency when faced with his father's death, but he'd prepared for the alternative. "I want you to know that I saw everything. Every lie Cheryl whispered in Dean's ear. Every suggestion that you were somehow failing me. Every attempt to turn my final months into a weapon against you. It broke my heart, but it also opened my eyes to who our son has become." The letter detailed things I hadn't even known about. Phone calls where Dean had suggested I was taking advantage of Harold's illness. Conversations where Cheryl had hinted that I was only staying married for financial security. Meetings where they'd presented Harold with evidence of my supposed mental decline. Things like forgetting to water plants or misplacing my reading glasses. They underestimated me, Harold had written. They thought a dying man wouldn't notice their manipulation, wouldn't have the strength to fight back. They were wrong on both counts. He'd documented everything. Recorded phone conversations where Dean discussed managing Mom after Dad's gone. Screenshots of text messages between Dean and Cheryl planning their strategy. Even photographs of financial documents Dean had tried to access without permission. I need you to understand something, Opal. This isn't about money, though I know the inheritance will give you security and independence. This is about respect. This is about ensuring that the woman who loved me faithfully for 45 years isn't destroyed by the greed and cruelty of people who should have protected her. The next part of the letter made me gasp out loud. Dean doesn't know that I was aware of his plans for the funeral. Cheryl sent him text messages about keeping you away from the church so you couldn't make a scene. They discussed how to present themselves as the grieving family while painting you as unstable. I have copies of all of it. So Harold had known, even as he lay dying, that Dean would try to exclude me from saying goodbye. The knowledge that he'd been aware of their cruelty, that he'd faced his final days knowing what was planned, filled me with a rage so pure it surprised me. But the letter continued with something that cooled my anger and replaced it with deep sadness. What hurts most isn't their greed. It's their willingness to destroy you to get what they want. Dean was a good boy once. You were a wonderful mother to him. But somewhere along the way, he chose to become someone I don't recognize. Cheryl saw his weaknesses and exploited them, but the choices were still his to make. Harold had included photocopies of text messages that painted Cheryl in an even worse light than I'd imagined. She'd systematically worked to isolate Dean from us, feeding his resentments and encouraging his worst impulses. Messages where she called me that old woman and discussed how to handle the inheritance situation once Harold died. But there were also messages from Dean that chilled me to the bone. Messages where he called his dying father dramatic and complained about having to visit so often. Messages where he calculated inheritance values and discussed whether Harold was taking too long to die. I set the letter down, feeling sick. This was my son, the baby I'd nursed through fevers and nightmares. The little boy who'd once made me Mother's Day cards with crooked hearts drawn in crayon. The final page of Harold's letter was the hardest to read. I know you're wondering if you failed as a mother. If there was something you could have done differently, the answer is no. Dean made his choices as an adult. You gave him love, guidance, and every opportunity to be a good man. What he chose to do with those gifts is on him, not you. I'm leaving you everything not just because you deserve it, but because I trust you to use it wisely. Live the life you want, Opal. Travel to those places we always talked about visiting. Buy books without checking the price. Take art classes. Be generous to people who show you genuine kindness. You've earned every comfort, every joy, every peaceful moment that's coming to you. And if Dean ever comes to his senses, if he ever remembers who he used to be and tries to make amends, the decision about forgiveness will be yours alone. Don't let anyone pressure you either way. You owe him nothing now. The letter ended with the words Harold had said to me thousands of times over our marriage. I love you more than words can say. Always and forever, your devoted husband, Harold. I sat in that quiet study for a long time, holding the letter against my chest. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into evening routines, families having dinner, children being called in from play, couples walking dogs in the fading light. Normal life continuing while my world had been completely transformed. My phone buzzed with a text message. Dean's number. We need to talk. There has to be a way to work this out. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Harold had been right. Dean still thought this was something that could be negotiated, manipulated, managed. He still didn't understand that his father had seen straight through him. Another message came through, this one longer. Mom, I know things got heated today. Maybe we both said things we didn't mean. Dad was obviously influenced by his illness. We can contest this, but it would be better if we worked together as a family. As a family. After everything he'd done, everything he'd said, he still thought he could use that word to control me. I turned off my phone and walked through the house that was now truly mine. In each room, I could feel Harold's love surrounding me, protecting me, ensuring that the final chapter of my life would be written on my own terms. Tomorrow, Dean would probably try calling, maybe even show up at the door, but tonight, I was finally free to grieve my husband properly, to remember our love without the shadow of betrayal hanging over everything. Harold had given me more than an inheritance. He'd given me the truth, and with it, the power to choose my own future. 3 months later, I stood in the empty living room of what had been our family home for 32 years, watching the moving truck pull away. The house had sold quickly. Apparently, Harold's excellent maintenance and my careful decorating had created something quite desirable. The new owners were a young couple with twin toddlers who'd fallen in love with the garden and the big kitchen where Harold and I had shared so many meals. It felt right, somehow, that the house would be filled with young voices again, with the chaos and joy of a growing family. Harold would have liked that. Dean had tried to contact me 17 times in those 3 months. Phone calls, text messages, even a letter delivered by his lawyer threatening to contest the will despite Mr. Morrison's warnings about the consequences. Each attempt had become more desperate, more angry, as the reality of his situation set in. The $10,000 Harold had left him was gone now, forfeited when Dean's lawyer filed the contest paperwork. True to Harold's wishes, that money had gone to the Cancer Research Foundation where Harold had volunteered. They'd even sent me a lovely note about establishing a small memorial fund in his name. I hadn't responded to any of Dean's communications. What was there to say? Harold's letter had made everything crystal clear. Dean's own words and actions had revealed who he'd chosen to become. The son I'd loved was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize and couldn't trust. My new apartment was in a senior living community called Sunset Gardens, about 40 minutes away from the old neighborhood. Not one of those depressing places where people go to wait for death, but a vibrant community with art studios, gardening clubs, and a book discussion group that met every Tuesday. I'd chosen the largest one-bedroom unit they had, with a small balcony overlooking the community garden. The walls were painted a warm butter yellow that reminded me of the kitchen in our first apartment, and I'd furnished it with pieces that held good memories and left behind the rest. Harold's photograph sat on the mantelpiece, not in mourning black, but surrounded by the small treasures we'd collected over the years, a shell from our honeymoon beach, a pressed flower from our 10th anniversary picnic, the little wooden bird he'd carved during his retirement. On this particular morning, I was preparing for something I'd never imagined I'd have the courage to do. The brochure lay open on my kitchen table. European River Cruise, a journey through history and beauty. 15 days sailing from Amsterdam to Budapest, with stops in Germany, Austria, and Hungary. Harold and I had talked about taking that exact trip for years, but there had always been something preventing it. Dean's college expenses, then his wedding, then the house renovations, then Harold's illness. We'd kept saying, next year, until there was no next year left. But I was going now. By myself, yes, but not alone. I carried Harold's love with me, and his explicit instructions to live the life I wanted. The phone rang as I was reviewing the packing list. I almost ignored it, but the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Whitfield? This is Sarah Chen from the community newsletter. We're doing a feature on new residents, and I wondered if you'd like to be included. I hesitated. I'd been keeping a low profile since moving here, not ready to explain my story or deal with questions about family. What would that involve? I asked. Just a short interview about your background. Your interests. What brought you to Sunset Gardens? We like to help people connect with others who share similar hobbies or experiences. Something about her voice was warm and genuine, and suddenly, I realized I was tired of hiding from my own life. All right, I said. I'd like that. The interview was scheduled for the following afternoon. As I prepared for it, I thought about what I wanted to say about myself. For so many years, I'd defined myself through my relationships, Harold's wife, Dean's mother. Now, at 73, I was finally free to figure out who Opal Whitfield really was. When Sarah arrived, she was younger than I'd expected, probably in her 40s, with kind eyes and an easy smile. We sat on my balcony with tea and the cookies I'd learned to make from watching cooking shows, a small pleasure I'd never had time for during the busy years. "So what brought you to Sunset Gardens?" she asked, notepad ready. I considered the question carefully. "I was recently widowed," I said. "After 45 years of marriage, I realized I needed to start a new chapter of my life, somewhere I could make new friends and pursue interests I'd put aside for too long. That must have been a difficult decision. Do you have family nearby?" The question I'd been dreading. But as I looked at this kind young woman, I found myself wanting to tell the truth. "I have a son, but we're not close anymore. Sometimes families grow apart, especially after loss. I've learned that family isn't always about blood relations. It's about the people who truly care about your well-being." Sarah nodded with understanding that suggested she might have her own complicated family story. "What are you most looking forward to in this new phase of your life?" For the first time in months, I found myself genuinely smiling. "Travel. I'm taking a river cruise through Europe next month, something my husband and I always planned to do but never had the chance. And I've signed up for watercolor classes here. I used to paint a little when I was young, but life got in the way." "That sounds wonderful. Any advice for other people who might be facing similar transitions?" I thought about Harold's letter, about his words encouraging me to live the life I wanted, about the pain of the past few months, but also about the unexpected freedom that had emerged from it. "Don't be afraid to start over," I said finally. "Don't let other people's expectations or judgments keep you from pursuing what makes you happy. Sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin when we thought the story was ending." After Sarah left, I sat on my balcony watching the sun set over the garden. Residents were gathering in the courtyard for the evening social hour, their laughter drifting up to my second-floor apartment. Tomorrow night I'd join them, I decided. It was time to stop hiding from life. My phone buzzed with another text from Dean. I glanced at it briefly. More of the same desperate attempts to reconnect, to work things out as a family. I deleted it without reading the full message and blocked his number permanently. Some people would probably think I was being too harsh, too unforgiving, but I'd learned something important in these past months. Forgiveness doesn't mean accepting continued harm. Love doesn't mean tolerating abuse. And family doesn't give anyone the right to destroy your peace. I pulled out the travel confirmation for my cruise, feeling a flutter of excitement and nervousness. In 3 weeks, I'd be standing on the deck of a riverboat, watching European countryside slide by, eating meals prepared by someone else, sleeping in a bed someone else would make. For the first time in my adult life, I was answerable only to myself. Harold had protected me in death as he had in life, ensuring that my final years would be filled with dignity, security, and choice. Dean had revealed his true character. And while that knowledge hurt, it had also freed me from the obligation to keep trying to fix an unfixable relationship. As darkness fell and the stars appeared over Sunset Gardens, I raised my evening tea in a silent toast to Harold's memory and to the unexpected gift of starting over at 73. Tomorrow, I would begin packing for Europe. Next week, I would start watercolor classes. And every day from now on, I would wake up knowing that my life belonged entirely to me. It was, I realized, exactly what Harold would have wanted for me. The end was actually a beginning. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.